Well, hello everyone. I want to welcome you to another of our lectures in our signature lecture series. And as you all know, particularly those who've come to other lectures, we cover a broad range of subject matter. And today we're very privileged to have someone who not only is a very important scholar, but has been an important figure in my own life, without whom, for better or for worse, I wouldn't be standing here before you today. And his name is Paul Hollander. He is a sociologist who spent his career, well, he had a career in a number of places, but most of it was spent at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And during the length of his career, he has produced 17 books on a remarkably wide range of subjects. One of those books, called Political Pilgrims, which is related to the subject matter that Professor Hollander will discuss here today, was actually a book that sort of catalyzed, had a catalytic effect on my own career history. When I read it, I was a professor of political science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and that was certainly a worthy thing to be. But after reading it, I realized that I had to go out and save the world. And of course, usually that's disastrous. But in my case, I think I could make a certain amount of reasonable justifications for my subsequent actions. I founded an organization called the National Association of Scholars, and after running that for 25 years, came here. And the reason the book prompted me to do that is that its essential message was how so many of America's and the Western world's intellectuals had deserted the cause of freedom and spent their time fawning over totalitarian regimes and tyrants. And it was so powerfully done that I thought I could not, after reading it, just sit idle. So that was a turning point in my life, and the gentleman we have here today is responsible for that. He's continued to write all sorts of books. For example, among the books that he's written is one on the people who try to find, who were seeking dates by putting personal advertisements in newspapers. I guess that happens online nowadays. But way back in the dim past, people would buy little advertisements, and they would describe themselves, men and women, in a manner that they hoped would attract somebody who was compatible with them. Well, I mean, this is a rich mind. How people present themselves in these kinds of situations is a rich mind of sociological analysis, and it was one that was deeply mined by Paul Hollander. His most recent book, sort of coming back to, in some ways, the subject of Political Pilgrims, is From Benito Mussolini to Hugo Chavez, Intellectuals and a Century of Political Hero Worship. How a whole lot of sordid characters who did a lot of damage to their countries and others, nonetheless, were seen as demagogues by a lot of smart folks who should have known better. So, I can't enlarge on it anymore without kind of treading on the ground that Professor Hollander can do much better than I. So I hope you can give him a nice Texas Tech welcome.
Let me start by thanking Steve first for inviting me. I have never been here before, so I'm pleased to find another academic setting, and I'm especially interested in your questions and comments, because what I have to say is totally familiar to me, but what I will hear from you hopefully won't be totally familiar, and will stimulate new ideas. Now, since I have an accent, whenever I meet somebody who has an accent, I tend to ask him where he is from. So my American-born wife thinks that this is a terrible thing to do and I shouldn't do it. It's not polite. But you may be interested in the source of my accent, which is Hungarian. And of course, this has a lot to do with my professional interests, my accent and my growing up in Hungary. Subsequently, I have always been interested in this connection between the personal and the political, or the personal and the professional. So I actually spent most of my life in this country, but I did grow up in Hungary, which meant that I had some personal experiences of World War II as a child, and then as Nazism, coming from a Jewish family, and then a communist regime, which was it's Stalinist, early Stalinist variety, and then came the revolution in '56, which I observed. I didn't do much, I just observed it. I was in some demonstrations, but and then I left finally after the revolution. And the rest of my life has been perfectly ordinary academic life. First I started in England, I went to college in England, and then graduate school here, and then I stayed here. And I have been back to Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe a number of times. I still like to visit, but I have never been tempted to move back, even in the post-communist period. So this kind of background, how did I become a sociologist? That was a pure accident. But when I got to England at the end of 1956, and I was one of a group of students, the British universities decided to fund 300 Hungarian students or aspiring students. So I was one of those, and I knew already some English, but I really had I didn't know what I wanted to study. And somebody took me around, an English student, and he took me to the London School of Economics, and I looked at the brochures and what they were teaching, and one field was sociology. I didn't even know what it was, because there was no such thing as sociology in communist Hungary. There was only, Marxism, Leninism. But it seemed interesting. It could have been, I could have chosen political science or social psychology or cultural anthropology or modern history, but it was sociology, and that's where I got my credentials. And I actually didn't feel in the course of my professional career that I had a very strong identity as a sociologist, and I never thought of sociology as a science, but it's certainly something which allows you to ask some interesting questions about the world and human beings, and what kind of answers you get. That depends a great deal. Now, so you see, because of this background, and I didn't mention that during the communist system, my family they had a very elaborate sociological system of classification, the communist government, and they attempted to predict behavior from social variables. So they were sort of amateur sociologists. So I happened to have had a capitalist grandfather on my mother's side, and was sufficient to be classified as politically undesirable, so I couldn't go to university in Hungary. And then the family was deported to a little village from the city of Budapest. But in retrospect, I thought that these were all interesting sociological experiences, and probably in a kind of subconscious way, they helped me to choose that occupation. So as a result of these kinds of experiences in Hungary, when I actually became a sociologist, I suppose once I was in graduate school and finished, and I also had a very peculiar dissertation topic I tell you about. And my dissertation topic also reflected my literary interests. I was using Soviet socialist realist novels as the source, and I was interested in the official conceptions of human nature or personifications of good and evil, as the Soviet writers were compelled to provide in the framework of this theory, socialist realism, which was basically a kind of a higher level propaganda. So that's what I called it models of behavior. That was my dissertation about. And subsequently I have written about the Soviet system, and more generally about totalitarianism, about intellectuals and politics, as Steve already mentioned. I have also been especially interested in the matter of ideas and practices, or theory and practice. And in some way that also has to explain this book. Steve mentioned this book about dating, but it's not so much about dating, it was more about the attempts to find romantic love in America. And when I used these, my interest began reading the personals in the New York Review of Books. And then I looked at some of these dating services. And, but what interested me again, sort of appearance and reality in how people try to relate to one another and how they try to present themselves in these ads, in these personals. And this is again related to my interest in political propaganda and also advertising, both of which try to misrepresent reality in different ways. So, and now that this last project, this last book about which I'm going to talk now, that reflects my interest in the ability or capacity of highly educated and often very well-meaning people to make horrendous political misjudgments. And obviously I have been impressed by this capacity of human beings to make this kind of political misjudgments, and perhaps there is some similarity between political misjudgments and the misjudgment people might make in their personal lives in a romantic relationship. Maybe there was this kind of connection between my interests. So this particular political misjudgment, I was looking at it in this last book, was the political hero worship. And mostly, but not exclusively, on the part of intellectuals. Now, why have I been interested in intellectuals? Well, I suppose because I am one of them, and also because I lived among them in academic settings, and also because I thought that they displayed this remarkable capacity for misjudgment, which I found all the more interesting and remarkable because many of these intellectuals I was dealing with, they were extremely critical of their own society. So they were capable of critical thinking, but then they went to these other places. This is what I wrote about in the Political Pilgrims, where I used basically travel writings. Intellectuals who first went to the Soviet Union, then to Cuba, then to China. Now these were the major places, but also to the lesser communist countries. Some even thought that North Korea was wonderful, or Albania. So in this book I'm talking about now, I was particularly interested in their views of these leaders of these countries, and I didn't write much about it in the Political Pilgrims. I wrote a little bit. And of course the other difference is that in this study I'm talking about now, I also included Mussolini and Hitler, not only the communist dictators. So actually the study has a chapter on, I start with Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Castro, and the lesser figures like Saddam Hussein and the Korean dynasty and a few other characters, and their admirers among intellectuals. But also I have been interested in this question of not only intellectuals were especially interesting because you would expect more of them. And you would wonder why an intellectual who is, take somebody like Bernard Shaw, the famous English writer, he was a very profound critic of his own society, Western society, capitalism, and then he goes to the Soviet Union or fascist Italy, and he thinks they are wonderful places. And there were a few people among Western intellectuals who were attracted to both fascist Italy and the communist Soviet Union. But most intellectuals were more attracted to the communist countries. So many questions can be raised, and I raised them on this topic. Perhaps one very basic question is, who exactly are the so-called intellectuals, or what's distinctive about them, or how do you become an intellectual? And by the way, I am not suggesting that, people criticize me, people who had the impression that I was sort of some of the critics of my writings had the impression that I was over-generalizing about intellectuals, and that, of course, not all intellectuals made these kinds of misjudgments. Certainly, Hitler and Mussolini didn't have a lot of admirers outside their own countries. Within their own countries, they had plenty of admirers. But they had some outside too, and it didn't last long. Now the communist systems and their leaders, they had far more admirers among intellectuals, but then again, there were a number of them. That's a separate topic. And actually, I also wrote a book about that. Intellectuals who became disillusioned with communist systems. There were many distinguished intellectuals, but probably not as many as those who had illusions about them. So, one major distinction one has to make between intellectuals who actually lived in these countries and others who visited them from abroad. And time permitting, I will give you some examples of these kinds of misjudgments. So again, who exactly are these intellectuals? And I went over many definitions, and obviously they are highly educated people, but they are also people who are interested in social, political, cultural issues, and not highly, in addition to their specialization, whatever it is. But I think basically they are not highly specialized. And you could also say, at least that's my view of the matter, that at least a substantial proportion of intellectuals, you could say, are idealistic, have high expectations, and perhaps are also prone to discontent. If you have high expectations, then you will be likely to develop discontents, because expectations and realities often don't match. And then another major question is, and of course these people, especially in more recent times, you find them mainly in colleges, in academic institutions, in the social sciences and humanities, not in the real sciences, or in engineering or business school. So I think that people gravitate to the humanities and social sciences who have some of these characteristics I mentioned. And high expectations and certain idealistic impulses, wanting to improve the society in some ways. Now, there were particular periods when Western intellectuals, you might say, went off the deep end in their political judgments, when things were going very badly in their own countries, like the Depression in the late 1920s and early 30s in the Western world, when the Western capitalist societies were doing very poorly. And lo and behold, there was the Soviet Union, which seemed to be doing so well, and there was no unemployment. And all of intellectuals went to the Soviet Union and took to look at it, and most of them returned with a positive assessment. A few of them did not. but most of them like what we saw. Of course, the other thing is that, and this is again this interesting, puzzling phenomenon emerges, that people like Bernard Shaw and others, they were not aware, or if they were aware, they somehow overlooked the fact that they were on conducted tours. They couldn't see everything they wanted to see or should have seen. Most of them couldn't speak the language, so they got a very carefully choreographed picture of life in the Soviet Union, and the same applied to other countries too. And some of these countries, certainly the Soviet Union, China and Cuba, went so far as actually developing model prisons where people were taken on conducted tours. And so all these prisoners having this wonderful life, getting rehabilitated and reading their classics. So it was very ironic that many of these systems got away with this. And then I remember one of my sources, there was a Polish writer, this was before World War II, who was a communist or leftist of some sort. And he went to the Soviet Union on one of these conducted tours. And this is in my political pilgrim book. And was very much impressed by what he saw. And then, after the Soviet Union occupied Poland, or maybe it was in the post-war period when Poland became a communist country, he was sent into a real prison in the Soviet Union. So he was one of these rare people who had the opportunity to compare the conducted tour reality with the true reality. And he wrote a book about this. But in any event, this was very interesting and puzzling. My distinguished intellectuals had these peculiar views and misperceptions and illusions. And as I said, I will give you some examples. But this is sort of getting ahead of the way I planned this talk. But there was, for example, Sartre, who went to Cuba. And he had the most incredible impressions of Castro and Che Guevara. He was totally fooled. And there he was a great social critic. So actually, from some of these books, some of these travel books, you learn much more about the writers than what they went to see. And clearly, this is again where the heroic personality cult comes into the picture, that many of these intellectuals also missed in the modern life the heroic aspects. And some figures like Castro, he was a wonderful hero, charismatic leader. But anyway, I wanted to say first something about the likely sources of these misperceptions and misjudgments on the part of intellectuals. And I think even at times when there were, as I said, there were historical explanations. One was in the early 30s that things were really going very poorly in the Western countries, and there was interest in finding some alternatives. But in the other period, when many of these intellectuals went on these, what I call pilgrimages, was in the 60s and 70s, when there was no economic crisis in the 60s and 70s, but there were other problems. Well, of course, you don't know that, you were too young, but you heard about them. You know, the 60s, there was the Vietnam War, and civil rights, and women's rights, and a lot of questioning of the qualities of Western societies. And not so much this time for economic reasons, but for cultural and political and social reasons. So at that time, there was sort of a new generation of pilgrims who went, hopefully, to look at superior societies in Cuba and China under Mao, and Vietnam. But what was really remarkable, again, about some of these misjudgments, that some of the most favorable accounts of the Soviet Union by these Western intellectuals were produced in the 1930s, when the system was the worst. It had the Cubans, it had famine, or just recovering from famine, forced collectivization, peasants forced into these collective farms, and a huge number of people designated as political enemies and shot or sent into the Gulag. And that was the time when a lot of Western intellectuals thought that the Soviet system was really doing wonders. And the parallel was with China in the late 60s and early 70s, when it had the Cultural Revolution. Again, that was the most unusual and in a way the most revolting episode in recent history in the mistreatment of human beings, and it actually had no parallel either in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, insofar as the mistreatment, well, it was stimulated, of course, by the government, by Mao himself, but evidently there were many people who hugely enjoyed it. So what happened with the so-called political enemies, that they were not just put in jail or executed or tortured, but they were publicly humiliated. So that was the unusual feature of the Cultural Revolution, this widespread public humiliation. You know, they put signs on them, and they put them in various uncomfortable positions in public, and they had to denounce themselves. So that was very unusual. But again, this was another period when many Western visitors thought that the Chinese were just doing wonders in creating a more humane and just society. But anyway, let me go back to this attempt to try to provide at least one explanation of what was the source of these illusions or misperceptions. Well, I already said, well, maybe something just has to do with the nature of the people who become intellectuals, that they are, well, that's what I'm talking about. I'm just introducing a new concept. Some of you may have heard about it. And this is the concept of relative deprivation, which was introduced by an American sociologist, Robert Merton. And what he meant by this, actually he used it not in connection with the things I have been writing about. He used it in connection with the nature of American society and crime. He actually had to use it in part to explain crime. Well, relative expectations. What Merton meant, or the essential meaning of the concept, is that people don't have to feel deprived for objective, discernible reasons, because they are poor, or don't have enough to eat, or are in poor health. And so it's not, of course, that can also be and is an important source of deprivation. But in addition, and especially as far as the intellectuals are concerned, relative deprivation means that you feel deprived either because you compare yourself to some other group of people who live better, and you think, why shouldn't I live the way they do? Or I think the second one is more relevant to intellectuals, because they compare objective conditions to some ideal, how things could be. So relative to that, I think this is especially applicable to American intellectuals, because I think Americans in general, I would say, it's a wide generalization, I would say that Americans are idealistic, more idealistic than many other nations or people. So, Americans are especially outraged when they criticize their own society, and they say, well, look, why should we have poor people? There is all this wealth. Why isn't it better distributed? Or look at the Declaration of Independence and the pursuit of happiness and equality, all these high ideas which were sort of incorporated into the very beginnings of this country. So, and people came here from abroad with high expectations, some of which were met, some of which were not met. So I think I think societies which have these kind of high ideas there is likely to be more of this kind of discontent and comparison of theory and practice, or ideas and realities. So I think, in other words, what matters most in accepting or rejecting one's position in society is not necessarily the objective situation, but how you feel about it. So people can feel deprived for all kinds of reasons. I mean, I'll give you a trivial example. That's not American, but a European, Hungarian example. That I was talking to some taxi driver about the fact that there are so many cars nowadays in Hungary or in Budapest. And he said, yes, but many of them are used cars, and we don't have enough Japanese cars. It's this kind of thing. So anyway, I think from an intellectual's point of view, the theoretical or idealistic aspect is the most important. That, there are ways intellectuals think, and this is certainly a laudable impulse, to improve matters. And I think that this is more the case in a society like American society. In other words, there are alternative conceptions of social organization and social justice. And this magnifies moral indignation, high expectations. I mean, and of course, you could say that capitalism itself stimulates high expectations, although they seem to be limited to consumption, but I think there is a kind of spillover. If you look at commercials, the expectations they try to stimulate are highly unrealistic and misleading, but nevertheless, you may come away with the impression, perhaps over years, over time, that by making the right purchase, you will be happy and successful, and every good thing in life will result from making the right purchase. So that's capitalism, or American-style capitalism especially. But I think it has something to do with these origins of the whole society and culture, high expectations. I mean, now there is another issue which is important for understanding the attitude of the intellectuals, in addition to this relative deprivation concept, which I tried to introduce now, that another basic problem, and it's not only intellectuals, but I'm mainly talking about intellectuals, and that is modernity. And I think this plays a greater part in this book I am talking about now. What you might call the discontents of modernity, especially when you look at these different societies, some of them which were Nazi and fascist, and some of them were communist, or different kinds of communist countries, that intellectuals, and not only intellectuals, they have a problem with modernity. What does it mean? And what's the problem of modernity? I'm sure you heard about it in some of your courses. I'm quite sure. I would say that modernity is distinct from capitalism, although of course there is an overlap. I think capitalism, the critiques of capitalism and the critiques of modernity are in some ways very similar and basic, especially if you go back to Marx's critiques of capitalism. And Marx was very much aware of the fact that capitalism undermines community, although he used different terminology, that it creates more social isolation, and that people develop these mistaken beliefs that by consumption they can really become happier. But yes, up to a point you get happier if you have enough to consume. But I mean, after a certain point, clearly there are other needs which consumption cannot gratify. So I think modernity, what modernity has brought about, modernity here you have to associate with secularization, or the decline of religion, or the decline of serious religious belief, because I think going to church means something. It's not meaningless, but and Americans go to church more than any other developed nation. But basically, the problem of modernity is a result of some of the good things about modernity, namely freedom and choice. And if there is a lot of freedom and choice, then of course it becomes more difficult to agree about the meaning of life or the purpose of life. So, moral relativism. Well, moral relativism, if you associate it with tolerance, it's a good thing. Tolerance is a good thing. But it's associated with moral relativism, So these are problems of modernity, that meaninglessness, but especially the decline of community. And of course, one need not idealize traditional societies, but there was such a thing as community. There were many other bad things about traditional societies, lack of freedom, scarcities, deprivations. But the decline of community, I think, is one of the major problems of modernity. Again, it's also associated with another thing we support, namely individualism, where we put emphasis on individual rights and individual accomplishments and social mobility. But it is a very, I read you a quote by an American author, Irving Howe. He said, "The hunger for community has been one of the deepest and most authentic of our century. It's one of the deepest desire for collective one is a wish for bounding fraternity. That was both the most yearned for and most treacherous in the 20th century. The most treacherous because you see countries like Nazi Germany in particular, that was one of their appeals, that there was a community, a national community. It was also the appeal of communist countries, which was more groundless. But I think in the Nazi and Italian case, it had a better basis, namely ethnic and national basis, shared culture, language, which proved to be a more important bond among people than class. So there is another good quote by the American sociologist Daniel Bell, who said that the real problem of modernity is the problem of belief. And of course, I mean, I was especially when I first came to this country, I was always amazed by the number of religions you can join, and sort of you shop around for your favorite religion. But that's very American, Of course, you couldn't do this in traditional societies, and it has some advantages if you can shop around for religions. My American wife, she was brought up as a Baptist, then she became a Catholic, then she became a Buddhist. None of this hurt her, but I mean, it's just interesting, and you don't find that in Europe, or much less of it, or not yet, let alone the rest of the world. So I think this is the real problem. I agree with Daniel Bell, and I read you one more quote. That's from another conservative social critic. Daniel Bell was not a conservative, he was a mixture of liberal and conservative, but Irving Kristol was clearly a conservative, and he said about modernity, the real trouble is not sociological or economic, it is that bourgeois society falls short of responding adequately to the full range of man's spiritual nature. It is this weakness that generates continual dissatisfaction, especially among those for whom material problems are no longer so urgent, when intellectuals come into this group. It is a religious vacuum, a lack of meaning in their own lives, and the absence of larger purpose in their society that terrifies and provokes them to, he puts it in quotation mark, alienation and unappeasable indignation. Right? That helps to, I think, somewhat understand intellectuals. But I think we run out of time, so actually I should give you some examples of these grotesque misperceptions. some of these intellectuals engaged in these countries. Well, let me just read, this is not about particular individuals, but a very typical view of the communist countries. And this comes from Eric Hobsbawm, who was a very famous British historian. And he actually started out as a refugee from Nazi Germany and became a communist. And he knew what the Soviet Union was like, but this is what he said in an interview in 1994. He was asked if he would have supported the Soviet system had he known about the mass murders of the 1930s. And he said that he would have done so because, and now quote, because of the chance of a new world being born in great suffering would still have been worth backing. In other words, the good intentions. That made a huge impression of intellectuals. Now, of course, there is a lot more to be said about modernity. And again, modernity is also bothersome for people who put value on individuals and individualism and modernity and modern society, mass and mass culture is associated with certain regimentation, and possibilities for heroic self-assertion are getting more limited. But as I said, I think in case of fascism and Nazism, the appeals of modernity, or rather the rejection of modernity, played a greater part than in the Soviet communist case. But as I said, I should give you some examples of what this book was written about, and perhaps I should also say one more thing to explain why the communist dictators and leaders were the subject of this admiration for a much longer period than, Hitler or Mussolini, for obvious reasons, because it became very quickly apparent, and of course the Western countries went to war with Nazi Germany. But I think with the communist countries, one obvious reason was simple ignorance of the real personalities of these leaders. And the second was this capacity for projection that these intellectuals could attribute qualities to these leaders which they didn't have, but they wished they would have. And most of it, I think this is again where the modernity angle comes in, that many of these dictators were seen, and sometimes even the word was used as redeemers, that they would really radically change the society for the better, in a kind of quasi-religious sense. I had a wonderful quote about China under Mao, which comes from an American author and journalist, Orville Schell. Very much a religious view of Mao, replete with Christian imagery. And this is what he said about Mao. I guess he wrote this after his death. This is the quote. Even prior to his death, Mao had transcended his own personality. He was a thinker as well as a doer. He conceived of the Chinese Revolution and helped it to happen. And in the process, the thought of Chairman Mao became inculcated in almost every Chinese. The word almost literally became flesh. And it seemed clear even before Mao died that his death could not erase the way in which he had almost become transubstantiated in his people. But aside from the religious terminology, of course, he was dead wrong, because you see, Mao is no longer admired by most people in China, as far as I know. And of course, there were other people too. For example, Jan Myrdal. Now, he was the son of the much more famous other Myrdal who wrote about race relations in America in the 40s. But this Jan Myrdal, he was unusual because he also thought that Cambodia under Pol Pot was a great place. But anyway, this is just about his quote about Mao. He said that Mao's legacy will endure since he solved the problem of how the revolution can be prevented from degenerating. Now, and people actually said similar things about Castro too. And of course, Castro again was a wonderful example. of hero worship because he has some heroic aspects. You know, he was a guerrilla fighter in the mountains, and he was physically impressive. And I just want to read you one quote about Chavez by Norman Mailer, the American, not Chavez, about Castro. And he said that, this was Norman Mailer about Castro: "You gave all of us who are alone in this country some sense that there were heroes in the world. It was as if the ghost of Cortez, you know, the explorer of America, had appeared in our century, riding Zapata's white horse. You were first and greatest hero to appear in the world since Second World War. You gave a bit of life to the best and most passionate men and women all over the earth. You are the answer to this is the point I wanted to illustrate. You are the answer to the argument that revolutions cannot last, that they turn corrupt or total, that they eat their own." And again, dead wrong, of course. You know, with the officially sanctioned prostitution, among other things. And then again, and I will have to finish soon, but I cannot resist something about Sartre and Castro. Sartre was very impressed when Castro told him that he became a professional revolutionary because Castro said, "I can't stand injustice." And Sartre wrote, "What pleased me in this answer was that this man has no other interests than the interests of people." And he recalled me his personal passions, his private life. And here is the really amazing conclusion. Sartre says about Castro, he learned the inanity of words. And this is the man who gave 5-hour speeches to captive audiences.
8-hour speeches.
Yeah.
8-hour speeches.
Yeah, or 8-hour speeches. So anyway, I should really conclude because we need some time for your questions. So let me just say something in conclusion. I could give you a lot more examples about some of the patterns or findings which emerge from the attitude of at least some notable Western intellectuals. Well, one is that they made wrong-headed judgments with great confidence, and not many of them retracted them later. And I think the attraction of the dictators was in part generated by their dissatisfaction with their own society, and that was especially rooted in their rejection of capitalism, and predisposed them to a kind of compensatory hero worship. They really believed that the dictators personified idealistic and just social systems, and they didn't see they knew little about the gulf between the dictators' professed goals and ideals and the prevailing conditions in their countries. So they wishfully projected on the dictators qualities and attributes they did not have. And of course this was made easier by ignorance and selective perception. And now, these were highly patterned and often bizarre misperceptions, and as I said, they can be best explained by the pressing need of some intellectuals to find alternatives to the social, political, and cultural conditions they deplored in their own societies. But it's also possible that individuals who gravitate to the role of intellectuals are, to begin with, as I said before, predisposed to discontent with familiar, long-standing social arrangements, perhaps their own life as well. You see, there was this other issue which was very important for intellectuals, this gap between theory and practice, or words and deed, and Castro seemed to be bringing them together, you know, words and deed. He was a revolutionary, actually fought, not an armchair revolutionary. So, and finally, these overdeveloped misperceptions could be linked to the secular religious impulses. And, you know, this search for a new meaning in life, which for many intellectuals, these dictators symbolized or personified. So I will stop now and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.